Good afternoon, everybody. This is Tim Hill, Associate Deputy Superintendent, Public School Finance. I have with me today the majority of the school finance team. I also have, as participants, I have Chris Campbell and Todd King from our Information Technology. Chris is our Chief Information Officer, and Todd King is, the head guy for all of the regional IC coordinators. I don't remember what his official title is. But we're here to address the attendance issues, IC reporting related to that, calendar issues in terms of emergency closure requirements, and the like. Now, I don't know for sure if Scott Phillips was able to call in today or not. He is in our communications team, and I spoke with him earlier about building some forms that we could make available to you for the two items that you're going to need to potentially submit. Those would be the attendance waivers and the waiver for calendars. Now, on that note, just let me, while I'm thinking about it, remembering, I was on an earlier conversation with some of the state board members who on Monday the 6th are going to be taking up the discussion of calendar waivers and exploring the legal options that they have to consider potentially, this is a potential thing, a waiver for everybody statewide. Ms. Bent from the State Board of Education reminded the board members, however, that they may be able to approve everybody, but that does not necessarily relinquish the requirement for each district and charter school to submit a separate waiver request. So with that, let me start with attendance. We, over the last several weeks, have had some seminars, some webinars, to discuss and answer questions on if I'm a brick and mortar program and I move to an online or a distance education, or I'm sending information home with my students, how in the world do I know whether they are engaged and for counting attendance? And so the answer I'm going to give, keeping in mind this would be a different answer if you had called us up and said, I want to become a blended program, I want to begin an online or distance learning program, and this is going to be part of my regular delivery of education. That is not the case today. The exceptions that we're talking about today is we believe that there is a time certain that this is going to cover. And it is very likely that that will cover the remainder of this school year. I'm not even going to go beyond that, but it's very likely that that will cover this year. And so that said, given the fact that we're going to have a different means to the same end, the end being that we have a statute, specifically 33-1003 capital A, and I'm going to read it. And it's actually up on the screen for everybody. What it says is, when a school is closed, or if a school remains open but attendance is significantly reduced because of storm, flood, failure of the heating plant, loss or damage to the school building, quarantine or order of any city, county, or state health agency, or for reason believed by the Board of Trustees to be in the best interest of the health, safety, or welfare of the pupils, the Board of Trustees, having certified to the State Department of Education the cause and duration of such closure or impacted attendance, the average daily attendance for such day or days of closure or impacted attendance shall be considered as being the same for the days when the school actually was in session or when attendance was not impacted. So I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about what that means and what you need to do. So what it means is that you have a requirement to submit to us, the department, specifically to public school finance, the cause, which in this case should be the same for everybody. It's the virus. The duration is potentially going to be similar, but not necessarily the same for everybody. So the duration needs to be identified, again, for most likely not just a day, which the statute references, but the number of days, those specific days of closure or impacted attendance. And so Pam Brewer from our office, who's on the line today and can respond, is the individual, the primary responsible for taking that information and working with our IT group to the IC data and identifying what that level of average daily attendance that would not be impacted. And what we generally do is we look at the activity immediately prior to those closure dates, and in some cases, if that is restored, in other words, if you were to resume operations, we would potentially look at afterwards. So we do our best to try to make this an issue where your average daily attendance is as it would have been had the cause of this impacted attendance not been the case. So let me get back to my earlier comment to say that that's the same end, but the means to that is the fact that we expect and hope that you're going to do your best to try to count and measure average daily attendance. Now, Todd King in our information technology group the other day sent me a sampling of some of the other states and what they're doing. I'm not intending to necessarily post this because I don't want to necessarily say we're going to adopt one or the other. But Minnesota had some pretty good ideas in line with what we were suggesting in our webinars previously, to include the students that are logging into class page or pages on the district or school's learning management system, to have email exchange or text exchange with the teacher to help identify attendance, that in some cases the parental input could be used to identify whether your students are engaged, activity in classes, the work submitted, the amount of information that you're sending home to be delivered for education, all of the above. And so at some point we have to just say, if you've done everything you can to provide education to your students and provided them with the necessary tools, then I think it's okay for at some point just to say, hey, I'm going to, hate to use this word, but assume that my students are in the educational process and can be counted for attendance. Now, in the event that after those efforts, if it still falls below what it should have been because it's impacted, then again, the end will be the same, is that you can then submit to us those affected day or days, and we're going to bring that up to normal. So just to use an extreme example, if you believe that you've done everything you can to provide education to your students and none of them are in the engaged in the education process, then that would still qualify as impacted attendance. So again, what we hope, I'm just going to re-summarize this, is that do your best to try to identify with a reasonable effort whether your students are in attendance or not, engaged in the educational process. And to the extent that that falls below where it should be, whether it's nothing at all or some percentage of what it should have been, by submitting in the waiver request, in this case, identified by, again, the cause and the duration, then once we receive that, then we'll process that information. Okay, I'm going to pause for just a minute, catch my breath, and again, regardless of what action the state board takes, we need to receive your information. And it does say the Board of Trustees having certified. So an email is probably fine. I'm going to let Pam talk in just one moment here as to what we've done in the past. But we need to have something where you, as whether you're a superintendent or a charter school administrator or a business manager, say that, you know, per our board meeting or minutes or whatever, the board has certified that this day or these days have been impacted by this cause. And so, Pam, why don't you jump in here and then add anything in terms of how you have handled this procedurally in the past.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yes.
They can hear you, Pam, yes.
Okay, good. But I wasn't sure if I took it off mute or not. So in the past, for impacted attendance, I have just accepted an email from the superintendent just stating the date of the impacted attendance, the cause of the impacted attendance, and the building. So if you have multiple buildings, And the reason why I did that in the past was because sometimes it was a flu that had gone through the district or charter, and only certain buildings were impacted. So I like to have the building, even though now it might be the all your buildings, but I would like buildings. So anyway, that's basically all I need to help with your impacted attendance.
Okay, so if you in the field have any questions on anything that we covered or didn't cover having to do with attendance, then please submit your questions. And then while you're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and begin discussing the calendar waiver requirements, which is covered in 33-512 Idaho Code, subsection 1H. And I believe that Mark Hill, who's managing our webinar today, is going to be pulling that up here in just a moment. I'm seeing him hover over that. And so let's scroll down to subsection H. And I will read through this. It's rather brief. It says the State Board of Education may grant a waiver of the minimum number of instructional hours for a school district when district-wide school closures are necessary as a result of natural occurrences creating unsafe conditions for students. And I'm going to skip down to a waiver request to the State Board of Education must describe the efforts. There's three things. Must, one, describe the efforts by the school district to make up lost instructional hours. And so this is going to vary. So if you are a virtual program, you may not even need a waiver. If you are a brick and mortar or a blended program that is attempting to provide online education, then you may still not be able to meet your minimum number of hours. So the second item would be the range of grades impacted. And the third item would be the number of hours the district, which would include charter schools, is requesting to be waived. And so in an earlier discussion this morning with various superintendents, the discussion was, well, I don't know how many hours I need to be waived yet until I know whether or not we're going to go back to school. And I think that on Monday, the State Board of Education is going to have further discussions on whether or not to extend the soft closure, and just be prepared that that could, one of the possibilities, now don't take this as a given, but just one of the possibilities is that they may decide that school's done for the year, that be based on the information they have available to them, and they may kick that down the road. So let's remember that we are in the first part of April, and that we will have time to, even though these two things we've talked about today are related, the calendar waiver is not near as urgent and has no, how do I want to say this, any effect on your funding as it does for the impacted ADA. We do need to get that information in the system so that we can use that average daily attendance to calculate your best 28 weeks, knowing that your weeks really aren't going to be affecting that midterm period from the first day of school to the first Friday in November. We're really talking about weeks that are affecting the best 28 weeks, which drive your discretionary portion of your funding. Okay, so back to the waiver requirements. Again, I mentioned earlier that what I heard this morning was that the State Board of Education will be having further discussions on whether or not they believe they have the legal authority and ability to grant statewide waivers, or whether the governor needs to do that, or if neither is the case, the fallback position is that we simply follow statute, and you have to then submit what was requested that I just read, and those would be submitted to us. And again, Scott Phillips in the agency from our communications team has been charged with building a form to help simplify and standardize the information that you need to submit. So with that, that's the end of my prepared remarks, and I would like to use the remainder of our time to address the questions you have. And time permitting, after we address all of the questions for attendance and calendars, I'd be happy to open up any questions for anything school finance, as long as it doesn't deal with federal dollars, which we don't deal with. So with that, Mark, do we have any questions?
Yes, Tim, we have a few questions, and I'll try not to be repetitive, but there are some questions coming in here, and then I'll just let whoever feels they want to address them on the panel go ahead and step in and address these questions accordingly.
Okay, thank you, Mark.
The first one is, what is the right time to submit the ADA waivers after we have concluded the school year?
Pam, would you like to take that one?
So I will take them anytime. So right now, the time period that's being affected is going to be when you upload your May IC information. So anytime after you upload the May IC information, you may send in a waiver, and I'll take them.
All right, so Pam, this is just a question, just thinking out loud here. So assuming that we're going to get a large volume of these, will that provide you sufficient amount of time to get those incorporated prior to our July 15th payment, or do we need to have that information sent in batches earlier?
Well, I won't be able to do anything until the May upload because none of the information is in the system. So you can send it in earlier if they know, but if they don't know, then they can wait. I'm hoping that I will be able to have a little help from a couple people in the office. So hopefully, yes, I will have time to do that.
Okay, in that regard, just to be consistent, let's just plan on everyone doing that with their May uploads.
Great.
It doesn't mean that you would. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Tim. This was Mark. I was going to read the next question, but it sounds like you have more.
Yeah, I was just going to qualify that to say it doesn't mean that Pam's going to turn your submission away if you do decide to send that in earlier. But I guess let me just say that if the majority of you want to send that in with your May uploads, that sounds like the plan that we're going to be able to accommodate. Yes, next question. Thank you, Mark.
Next question, do you have the calendar waiver form and when will it be sent out?
Okay, that my understanding from my discussion with Scott Phillips is he's building the form today, but we're going to hold that until after the Monday meeting to decide whether or not that form will be necessary to be sent out. At such time, right after Monday, if the State Board of Education decides on what their ability is to grant statewide waivers or not, or whether or not they're going to still need the statutory requirement of filling in the form, we will make that available and we'll send that out statewide. All school districts, all charter schools, superintendents, charter school administrators, and business managers. Next question.
All right. Our learning management system defaults a present attendance status. Would you prefer that while we are doing our very best to accurately mark attendance, to see all students marked as present and then submit a waiver, or marked as all as absent and then submit a waiver?
I'm going to throw out a lifeline to my IC friends. I'm going to, Todd, do you have a preference?
Sorry, can you hear me?
I can now.
Helps when I unmute. I think the guidance that we have been giving is that in this case, if the students are not present, to go ahead and code them as not present and then submit that waiver.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next question.
Does ADA waiver need board approval or can it be submitted by superintendent?
Well, the statute does say certified by the board. So the superintendent may submit that, from what I understood Pam to say earlier. But in that email, I guess I would like to see evidence of that. And now that evidence can take the form of something that you have attached, whether your board minutes, or it could just simply be a verbal statement that just says that that your board approved or certified the cause and duration of impacted ADA. I'm fine with either of those. Pam, do you have any comments on that?
No, I'm fine with either of those also.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next question.
If we transitioned immediately from brick and mortar to virtual without losing any instructional days, do we still need to submit an ADA waiver?
I'm sorry, would you repeat that one more time? I was looking at an email that someone sent in regards to the webinar.
Yes. If we transitioned immediately from brick and mortar to virtual without losing any instructional days, do we still need to submit an ADA waiver?
Okay, the answer is if you don't believe, or if you believe your ADA has not been impacted, then no, you don't need to submit a waiver.
Okay, next question. How will that work when teachers in some school districts are telling parents they are sending packets, but they aren't required to do any of it? Do those districts and schools still get to count full attendance?
Okay, if I understood the question, you're saying that the teachers are saying to the families that they've sent materials home, but they don't need to do anything? Was that what I heard?
So, Tim, I'll read that question one more time. Sorry, it's worded exactly this way.
Okay.
How will that work when teachers in some school districts are telling parents they are sending packets, but they aren't required to do any of it? Do those districts and schools still get to count full attendance?
I would say no. Well, again, if the parents are going to, I guess, do what the teachers suggest, and I would have to say this isn't going to be an all or none. So, I mean, it sounds to me like that statement is optional. If I'm that family and the teacher contacts me and my children, the students are being told that they have a choice of whether to do it or not do it, that suggests to me that that particular district or charter school needs to find out which students have chosen to work on their education and which ones have not chosen to work on their education. And again, the end result is that likely to create an impacted attendance situation that we would then bring up to had this not been the case. And so that actually makes it, in my assessment, even more critical to try to measure attendance. And again, I think that if I were just the general public and wanted to say, well, what efforts are the schools doing to continue to educate our children? The efforts that you have in place to measure average day or attendance, not average, to measure your attendance shows it's evidence of your efforts to provide education as you are able to, even though your brick and mortar situation is closed down. Sorry for the long answer. Next question.
If we provide 4 hours per day and student access the material, could that mean 100% attendance?
That was one of the examples I think I gave earlier, is that if you have sent home what you believe is a full day of education for your students, and again, you have to either, one, have proof that they were actually engaged in the education process, or, and again, we're not going to challenge this. In other words, if you've made your best efforts to provide education and you believe your students are in the education process, then by all means count them as being in attendance. And if you believe that would be better to either have some validation of that through the student, through the parent, through some sort of communication, text, email, whatever, even if it was just at the end of the week or the end of the period, to say that that my student was engaged daily in a full day of education. We're going to have to be flexible and take what I'm hoping is a common sense approach to this. And so again, this needs to be your best efforts. This again would be a much different scenario and a much different answer if all of a sudden, the state was saying, well, we're just not going to have brick and mortar schools anymore. We're going to have a statewide online educational distance learning program. And that's not the case here. What we're really trying to do is to say, what can we do to get us through this time certain, this relatively short amount of time? And let's put this in perspective. The weeks that we're talking about, even if they are your poorest weeks of the year, are not going to be even factored into the best 28 weeks. So if in fact these weeks that we're talking about between April and May end up being some of your higher weeks, then they will factor in, but they're proportionately going to be a very small amount in terms of a weighted basis. The majority of your weeks, which are generally the first weeks of school of the year, are really what's going to drive your discretionary monies, and then we're going to take the best of what's left. So your first 10 weeks or so are generally the best for the year, and then we take the remaining best of the final 26 weeks to get to a total of 28 out of those first 10, and the best of the remaining 26, and that drives your discretionary support unit funding, which is again about 1/4 of the total unit value. So we're really talking about, I don't want to say it's immaterial, but it's relatively small impact. Everything we're talking about sounds like it's really critical, and it is, it's necessary. But I want to just put it in perspective from a funding perspective. These weeks that we're talking about may affect your best 28 weeks, and they may not. And at the end of the day, because of if you submit to us any day or days that you believe are impacted, it's not going to reduce your funding. You're going to bring those attendance levels back up to where they would have been, and you're going to get your funding for the year. So that's the assurance that I want to give today. If you take nothing else away from this, just know that if you help us help you by submitting the information we need, we can get your average daily attendance to where it would have been, and you will see no negative effects from funding. Next question.
Who again was to get email on ADA waiver?
We're supposed to, we'll receive those in public school finance, and specifically, you can send them to Pam Brewer. And on the Q&A today, we'll include her email address and her office number. Our office numbers have been forwarded to our mobile phones. We're all working off-site, which is no surprise, but we will list that information on the Q&A portion of the webinar that'll be posted within a day or two. Next question.
So are they, let's see, sorry, Tim, I'm just trying not to repeat here. If we are doing remote lessons right now and teaching our students remotely online, do we still need to submit the waiver for attendance to Pam?
Now I'll repeat this for confirmation. If your attendance is not impacted because you are providing what you believe is attendance as if the cause of the virus was not in place, if you don't believe your attendance is impacted, you do not need to send anything in to us. It's only if you believe your attendance has been impacted by the cause, which is the virus. Next question.
Our board approved our emergency closure for March 18th and 19th, which will be used for our waiver request. However, the 2 days before that were extremely low attendance, and we didn't take any board action on those. Should we include those days in the waiver, even though the board didn't approve anything for those days?
Okay, I might have to restate that question. I want to make sure whether we're talking about attendance or calendar hours.
Definitely. Our board approved our emergency closure for March 18th and 19th, which will be used for our waiver request. However, the 2 days before that were extremely low attendance, and we didn't take any board action on those. Should we include those days in the waiver, even though the board didn't approve anything for those days?
Okay, thank you for repeating that. So for purposes of calendar hours, if you were open, then no, you don't need to include those days for the waiver request. But for purposes of impacted attendance, then yes, by all means, I think that you could show that the reduced attendance on those days was a result of the virus, and that you can include those days to be included in the email to Pam so that she can bring your average daily attendance back up to what it would have been without the cause. Next question.
Can we still expect the May 15th payment on time, even though the March ICE upload deadline was extended?
Yes. Yes is the short answer. The team and I have been talking twice a week, Mondays and Thursdays, and we had that discussion. We believe that there is still sufficient time for us to take the extended upload time frame and do what we need to do. Now, let's also remember that the extended March uploads are, unless there's anything that's affecting the period of time from the first day of school to the first Friday in November, the May payment is a function of our midterm units, not the best 28-week units. So any information that you upload that is not affecting that first 10-week period will not affect your May payment. It will, however, potentially affect your end of the year payment for discretionary if in fact those weeks are affecting your best 28 weeks. Likewise, any staffing changes that you submit in your March uploads that's been extended would in fact be incorporated into your May 15th payment. Again, we talked about this, and unless there's just an unreasonable volume of revisions and changes, which I wouldn't expect to be the case, then Brandon and Mandy in our shop should be able to get all of those processed and reflected in your May payment. Worst case is those will be reflected in July, but it's very likely that we'll get all of those done for May. And there will be no delay in the May payment. We will be able to make those calculations, and once we hand that off to our accounting team, they, as long as they can do their work, which they've been able to so far, and the state controller and the treasurer, which I can't speak for, have been able to do their jobs so far off-site, I don't see any reason why there would be any delay. Next question.
Okay, Tim, I have multiple questions that are along the same line, so I'm going to try and combine these. I'm getting a lot of questions about, can you discuss the 1% holdback? Do we know what the holdback will be in May? And how is that going to affect us going forward?
Okay, the meeting that I participated in this morning is still working on that, and there has not yet been a final determination. So there's still, and that meeting, by the way, was very well representative regionally by superintendents, and I don't know who else was on that, but I can just say that they understand the urgency of you being able to know not only for this year, but as importantly next year, because negotiations are coming up very quickly. So I have nothing else to share, but I know that the governor's office, through Greg Wilson and Gideon Tolman, are expecting to try to get information out just as quickly as possible. I don't know if we're going to see anything this week, maybe, but if not this week, then very, very early next week, I hope. Next question.
Do school districts need to plan on a budget reduction for next year? If so, how much should we anticipate?
Well, I guess the same answer is that I think it's very likely. I think the probability is high that we will see reduced appropriations next year. The question is how much, and whether or not the governor has the ability to take any official action, or whether he is going to basically say, here's my plan, and that will have to be validated by the upcoming legislature next January. So I guess what I mean by that is the governor could say, either one, he has the power to make that effective, any reductions for next year for fiscal year 21, or if he doesn't believe he has that power and has to wait for the legislature, he has two options. Either they're calling them back into a special session, which I would say is not likely, or waiting until January and hope that they would, I guess, adopt his recommendations in terms of the level and the areas that I've heard discussed, for example, is, freezing the career ladder, maybe even delaying the second year of the beginning teacher increases. I mean, those are the kind of things that are being discussed. Nothing has been decided at this point. Again, that will be, I'm sure, in the communication either later this week, which is we're down to a 1 day tomorrow, or very early next week. Next question.
Our district moved from brick and mortar school 1 day to online school the next day. Our large neighboring district took 2 weeks off, both teachers and students, between the transitions. Are we treated the same?
All right, let's talk about the effects of both calendar and ADA. So if the district was actually closed and didn't make any attempt to offer education, then that is simply a no day of attendance. And that, in my assessment, we would not adjust average daily attendance. There's got to be some effort to deliver education for attendance to be impacted. There's got to be some attendance. You can't just say we're closed, because right now, for any day that you're closed as a school district charter school, that's no day of attendance. You are closed. So that would affect the minimum number of hours, but in my assessment, that would not affect impacted average daily attendance. Now, I'm going to review what I said earlier. The bottom line is that a no week or a poor week of attendance during the April and May period, if it's not included in your best 28 weeks anyway, is really a moot issue. We're going to take your best 28 weeks to drive your discretionary monies. And so let's remember that in that scenario that was just presented, in both cases, maybe neither of those weeks in either of those programs would be even included in the best 28 weeks. So in that regard, yes, you'd be treated the same, but nobody would have any unfair advantage over the other one unless the week of the provider, was part of the best 28 weeks, and they would get a slight benefit from having provided that education that week. Sorry for the long answer. I hope that made sense. Next question.
Do IC submission dates remain the same for the remaining of the school year?
Mr. King, would you please?
Yes. Short answer. At this time, I don't have any guidance on expanding those dates, but as we get closer, we'll know more. So the short answer at this time, I have to say yes, those dates are locked in.
Thank you. Next question.
Tim, just an administrative thing here. We're getting a lot of questions coming in, and I'm really trying to not repeat here. So if your question has been answered, can you please just send another question saying answered already so that I can delete your question? Next question I have is, this has nothing to do with ADA or instructional hours, but due to events being canceled, we will not be able to spend the majority of our professional development money. Will we be given discretionary to use the money elsewhere or carry it over?
Well, Kim, I'm glad you asked that question. That was one of the discussion items this morning, is along with the 1% holdback for this year, for fiscal year 20, was discussion on providing flexibility for any unused special distributions, a number of which were discussed, and nothing has, again, been officially decided. But that was the direction that the superintendents requested in packaging that with the 1% holdback. So that's to be determined. Next question.
Why try to track attendance if we can just use our average from past? It will be very difficult to determine if students are working on packets. Okay,
well, I guess, that's a good point, is that if you don't know what your effective attendance is through your efforts, then that it prohibits you from having to defend any challenges from your patrons, from your families, from whomever, from anybody who's saying, why didn't you? So this becomes, I think, evidence of your efforts to try to collect the attendance. The bottom line is that if you send us in a form that says that we did everything we could to provide attendance, we don't exactly know what our attendance was and it was impacted, please bring it back up to the average that it should have been, we will do that. So again, the value in you being able to show that you made every good faith effort to measure your attendance helps you to defend any challenges from those who are being critical to say, well, why didn't you? So I'll leave that up to you to decide. There's my 2 cents. And by the way, anybody on the panel who would like to add anything, or please feel free. I don't want to monopolize this thing today, but don't be shy if there's anything that you'd like to add or clarify. Anybody? Thank you. Next question.
Todd King stated to mark them all absent and then submit a waiver. But if we are providing the 4 hours of instruction and you feel the students are being engaged and doing the work, they should be marked present, shouldn't they?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, there's 2 yeses.
I think my answer towards the question that was previously asked, I was not clear on that indication that you were making efforts to instruct the student, and that you were making efforts in determining how to measure their attendance. So if I misunderstood the question, I apologize.
Okay, next question. Our charter school is not a virtual school. Our calendar days are 6.25 hours. Our attendance days during soft closure are 4 hours. Do you advise that we submit an ADA waiver?
Well, I guess I would have to ask the question back to say, was your attendance affected? Was it impacted? And if the answer to that is yes, then you submit that day or days that were impacted. That's what it gets down to, is that do you as a charter school or school district believe that any given day was affected, was impacted because of the cause of the virus? And if the answer is yes, submit that day or days. If you don't believe that it was affected, then don't.
Can I interject something?
Yes, please.
So basically, when you submit your IC attendance, it's either a full day or a half day. So whether you are providing 6 hours or 4 hours, it's still going to be a full day. So you would just mark the students full day of attendance, right? Isn't that what I'm? So they wouldn't have really impacted attendance, in my understanding, right?
Yes, in other words, if they're a 4-day week with 6.25-hour days, then yes, that's correct. And then again, no day, as we mentioned earlier, does not factor in at all. That doesn't, I mean, a no day is not part of your average. Okay, next question.
So to clarify, if teachers are virtually teaching, homework packets, taking grades, etc., don't code the students absent. Also, no need to send waiver to Pam Brewer.
I would say yes. And again, I don't want to say a yes or no on the second one. I'm going to repeat it just for confirmation. If you believe your attendance on any given day or days was impacted, meaning less than it should be, then submit that information to Pam so that she can look at what the averages were and make the necessary adjustments. If you don't believe that your any given day is impacted, then don't. I mean, I hate to make it that simple, but it really is. And it's up to you to determine whether or not you believe any given day was impacted or not. If you submit it to us, and for example, let's just say someone submitted a week that they thought was impacted, but the average was right in line with the weeks prior or subsequent. We would have nothing to adjust. So that this is your call to say, we believe this day or days were affected, and submit that into us. Next question.
Okay. Please address transportation. How is reimbursement affected, and do we have to be delivering meals or curriculum to have any sort of reimbursement coming for this time? Lastly, is the state looking at potential waiver or assistance for transportation issues?
Okay, now just so you know, our role in transportation is to get handed off the reimbursements from our transportation team and include them in your payments. We do not look at any or work with any of the reimbursable amounts. And so this really isn't anything that I can answer. I can tell you that these questions have come up during our previous department webinars, and Derek in our transportation, I'm sorry, I can't remember his name offhand here. Derek Newland, our director of transportation, has been working with the executive team of the department to try to address eligible reimbursable expenses. And what I remember hearing was that if bus drivers are doing the things that was just described, delivering meals, delivering educational materials or whatever, that I believe I heard that that would be a reimbursable expense. So the other answer was maybe a little bit more broader than that, or the question was a little broader than that, is that what are we doing to try to address your transportation expenses? And again, I'm going to have to defer that over to Derek Newland. So I don't have his email right offhand, but I will just pull it up on an email here and type it in and see. It's D Newland, so DNEWLAND at sde.idaho.gov. So if you want to direct your question to him through an email, that would be probably a good idea. Next question.
Tim, on a follow-up on that, somebody just commented that every Tuesday there's a transportation webinar to answer those questions. And I believe if you look at our website on the coronavirus.idaho.gov under schools and resources for schools, there's transportation tab accordion there. And I know that all departments are trying to post all their stuff there. So if you're looking for more information on that webinar, you should be able to find it there.
Great, thank you, Mark. Okay, next question.
Okay. Going forward on potential cuts for fiscal year 2021, would a potential 5% cut be based on this year's funding or projections for next year?
Well, that's a tough one to answer, but I'm just going to give it my best shot. I think at this point, the 5% would be a function of what was approved for fiscal year 21. So that was roughly a little over 4%. So, and then in total. And the challenge in that is going to be identifying the difference between what I would call a maintenance item or a growth item and a line item. A line item is generally something that is additive, additional, like it may be an increase in base salaries, a change in employee compensation, the enhancement of the career ladder by adding the third tier, the enhancement of the initial residential rungs, the second year of the governor's bill from a year ago. Those are the kind of things I would qualify as line items. And so it's going to be very challenging to, I guess, but possible to identify all the components in the fiscal year 21 appropriation that was approved by the legislature and the governor to identify what items would be considered as either being delayed or repealed. So, but anyway, the short answer is I believe that the 5% would be a function of what was approved for fiscal year 21. And then again, this is yet to be disclosed to us. This is all speculative at this point. And again, I heard this morning that the governor's office recognizes that you in the field need to know as soon as possible what's going on for not only this year, but for next year. Next question.
Also, I was just reminded by Carly here at the Department of Education, these webinars are also being posted to the SDE site under events. So if you go there, I've got it currently showing on the site there as well.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
This is a non-attendance related question, and it involves stimulus funding, so not sure if you will want to answer, as the stimulus funds involve federal funding. If you want to answer or can answer, please feel free. Based on the webinar that occurred yesterday, is there further guidance on what expenses would qualify under the stimulus package?
I'm going to have to defer that. Our team doesn't work with the federal dollars, so that's a question for Karen C., the director of our federal programs, and maybe potentially Marilyn Whitney, our chief communications officer.
Okay, next question, Tim. We have parents complaining that 4 hours is too long to keep their children engaged in schoolwork each day. Is there any leeway in that 4-hour requirement?
The answer to that is no, unless the State Board of Education is willing to go into the administrative rule and waive those. I don't expect that's going to be the case. So let's play this scenario out. Let's just say that you do everything you can to provide the full day of attendance for your students at home. And the parents say, can't do it. We can only do somewhere between 2.5 and 4 hours. So realistically, that would be a half day of attendance for those students, which would create impacted ADA. Send that into us, we bring it back up. And again, so this is your best effort to do what your best efforts to try to provide a full day of education, and there's just some things that are out of your control. But again, knowing this is that if you get criticized for a waiver request and someone says, well, why did you submit your impacted attendance report? Why didn't you provide education? And you can come back and say, well, we did, but some parents just decided that 4 hours was just too much. So that's out of your control. But the good news is that you'll be able to get an adjustment on your attendance for that day or days. Next question.
I have a couple of questions here related to holdbacks. Are you able to comment on potential state holdbacks for 2020 and 2021? And can you clarify when next year's holdback decisions will be made?
Yeah, I suspect this question was probably asked before they knew that I already answered this. So I'm going to answer it again. That I expect as early as tomorrow, but probably more likely early next week is when we're going to hear the governor's official executive order addressing 2020 holdback and the direction that he believes that he can take for fiscal year 21. And again, the big question is, what authority does he have at this point to affect the 2021 appropriation, or whether he's really at the, how do I want to say this, having to wait for the legislature to take their action. But again, that should be coming to you at the latest, I hope, early next week, just from what I heard this morning. Okay, next question.
When we had holdback before, maintenance requirements were waived. Can we expect the same for next year?
Well, that's a possibility, but and I know that that's being considered. I mean, everything's on the table right now. I heard that this morning that they're looking at all sorts of facilities distributions, but we need to remember that at this late position or this late time in the year, a lot of the dollars have already been spent. Now, next year is a different situation. I do expect, again, that every single item in the state appropriation for public schools will be looked at and reviewed to say how much flexibility or leeway is there, and what action, either legislatively or through the executive office, need to take place, or even through the state board through rules, need to be amended or repealed or changed, waived in order for that to happen. So again, that's one of very many things that are being looked at. Next question.
Next question. I'm still confused. Should I count students as attending if they complete their coursework, or do I count them as absent because they are not physically present at the school?
Okay, the answer is if they are engaged in a full day of attendance off-site, you may count them as in attendance that day. Next question.
Tim, that concludes all the questions I have. I do have a couple comments by multiple people saying, tell Tim, thank you for being so consistent, and to his team for being level-headed, and they appreciate you more than you know.
Well, ditto. I mean, we wouldn't have a job without all of our customers, and so I can say that I don't know how encouraging this is, but there's more questions than answers right now. And whether we're talking about funding or we're talking about the general economy or how bad this is going to get before it gets better. And so I appreciate everybody's patience and understanding as we attack this day at a time. And I can just tell you that what I told my bosses at the department is that just the fact that we're home is not going to keep us from getting our job done. I think that evidence of that is all the special distribution payments we've made over the last 2 weeks. I just got the last response I needed for the ADA by county last year for federal forest funds. State treasurer got notifications those monies came in a day or two ago, so we're going to get everything done to get you paid. And even without data, we would make sure that money got out the door, even if it were estimates. And so nothing's going to keep us from making sure that you can keep your operations going, whether it's off-site or hopefully very soon back on-site. And so thank you for those nice comments. I think I speak for the whole team in that appreciation. And in the event that any of you have any additional questions after this, we're available by phone, by email, and we'll get back to you as quickly as possible. So thank you for that. Thank you, Mark and Chris, for getting this set up. Thank
Tim,
you,
I have
Todd,
one
for your
more
interest today. Oh, one more. Okay.
Yeah, one
Fire
more.
away.
Sorry about that. We just got a last-minute one here. Are forest funds comparable to last year?